You're listening to a tuned in, dropped out production. Thanks, y'all. Hey y'all, welcome back to Yes We Cannabis, a journey into medical marijuana. I'm Callie, your friendly outdoor grown, probably high neighborhood medical cannabis consultant, and we are back to talk about one of my favorite things, nature's medicine, aka cannabis. So today we are going to discuss the history of cannabis in the United States of America. If you have the ability to watch the video of this episode, I do recommend it. Zach has put together like a little show of tabloid like photos and statistics that go along with what we're going to be talking about. And I just think it's a really cool addition. So highly recommend. All right, so let's dive in. In order to really understand the history of cannabis in our country, we have to go back to the days of early colonialism. So before we won our independence in 1776, the U.S. was under the rule of British Empire, which you might have learned in school if you went to a school like me. And in 1619, King James I declared the colonists of Jamestown, Virginia, to grow and export hemp to England in order to support their cause, aka colonialism. And this was the first big introduction of the cannabis plant into our American history, which originally was a means of production for fiber and making clothing, sails, ropes, the like. Another big moment in our history that occurred, which is important to note, in 1619 was the arrival of British privateer ships that were carrying enslaved Africans that would later build the foundation of our country. So production of hemp continued as colonists started to expand into the Americas, thus instilling it as one of America's first big industries. George Washington is well known for growing hemp on his Mount Vernon plantation, thus making our first president a cultivator of cannabis. Well, he didn't cultivate it. We all know who did. And if you don't, do some research. Hemp became the fiber of choice through the 18th and 19th centuries, and cannabis as a medicine became available in pharmacies in the 1850s. Around this time, regulation laws in regards to pharmacies were starting to spread through the states, some in response to snake oil salesmen that were selling patent medicines, which meant that they could conceal the dangerous ingredients to unaware customers. Snake oil salesman, it's like that term comes from this era. And another one of these laws required any medicine that had altering effects had to come with the word poisons on the label and could only be obtained with a doctor's prescription, and discernment of these laws were up to the medical professionals. Despite all the new laws mentioning cannabis by name, in 1853, recreational cannabis was known as a fashionable narcotic, being consumed in hashish parlors in almost every major city on the East Coast, right alongside the opium dens. In 1905, the United States Department of Agriculture issued a bulletin that listed 29 states that had laws mentioning cannabis, 8 of which included the sale of poison laws. In 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed, requiring specific drugs, including cannabis, to be accurately labeled with its contents. So up until this point, states had the most sway in regards to enforcing their own laws, and as you might have guessed, loopholes were being found in abundance in regards to marijuana. In 1910, a big sweep of federal legislation passed to remove these loopholes, and suddenly the federal government could decide to ignore state laws and prosecute those they found operating illegally by their recently passed laws, which is when our history begins to get a bit spicy, as often happens when the federal government gets involved in things. So the U.S. saw a large influx of Mexican-American immigrants on the West Coast after the Mexican Revolution of 1910, and California became the first state on this coast to pass laws classifying cannabis as a poison following the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act. So as expected, there were plenty of operations that used the loopholes I mentioned earlier, and in hopes of controlling the regulation of cannabis, the federal government worked to bypass the states in regards to law enforcement. And the first known raid of cannabis was in 1914 in the Mexican-American neighborhood of Sonora Town in Los Angeles. This was one of the springboards for the tensions between Mexican immigrants and the U.S., like when it really started, getting a little spicy. Cannabis quickly became associated with Mexican Americans because many agricultural workers and laborers would often smoke the herb to get through really long work days because it helped with their bodies. During Prohibition in the 1920s, tensions grew as large farms started overtaking smaller farms because of their use in cheaper Mexican-American labor. And by the time the Great Depression hit, the lack of jobs was another big springboard for the radicalizing tensions that continued to build between the communities. So I am going to take a moment to put a pause on this timeline of cannabis in America to talk about someone that I believe is pretty influential when it comes to propaganda and anti-cannabis legislation that started to appear in our federal government. So in order to talk about the history of cannabis in our country, you do have to talk politics. One of the largest factors in the continued oppression of the plant are rooted in the systematic issues that have built our political system. So you will find many stubborn narratives from old propaganda that folks still spout when conversations turn to cannabis. They span many different generations, but I truly believe beliefs based in propaganda usually need to be deconstructed, or at least looked at. And speaking of propaganda, it is time to talk about Harry J. Anslinger. So Anslinger was born in Altoona, Pennsylvania in 1892 to Swiss and German parents. His family immigrated to the U.S. in 1881 and moved to Altoona in 1883, where his father eventually worked on the Pennsylvania Railroad. A young Harry followed in his father's footsteps and started working alongside him on the railroad by the age of 14, while also attending high school. He would eventually attend Pennsylvania State College, where he would receive his associates in business and engineering. Anslinger was quick to notoriety, and by the age of 23, he was an investigator for the Pennsylvania Railroad, where he rose to fame after tracking down the $50,000 claim of a widower after a railway accident that ended up being fraudulent. This saved the company, and then he was promoted to be captain of the railway police. He would eventually see himself move through military and police organizations from 1917 to 1928, and these duties would take him all over the world. He is very much credited in shaping both America's drug policies and having a huge influence on international drug policies as well, often in countries that hadn't even debated the issue internally, which is very interesting. In 1929, Anslinger ended his international tour and became the assistant commissioner for the narcotics division of the Bureau of Prohibition after Levi Nutt, the man who held the title prior to him, ended up being involved with a scandal surrounding the business relationship of his son and the bootlegger Arnold Rothstein, which proved him to be a corrupt figure, something Anslinger was not perceived to be. He eventually found his way to the seat of the Commissioner of the Treasury's Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which mainly targeted the illegal trade of alcohol and drugs. By 1930, Anslinger was tirelessly working to collect stories of cannabis causing violence and crime while blatantly ignoring evidence for other interpretations. Many established physicians and journalists actively spoke out against Anslinger's claims, including Dr. Walter Broomberg, who pointed out that out of 2016 criminal convictions he had examined, none of them were connected to the influence of cannabis, something Anslinger had continuously claimed. His adamant agenda to ban cannabis caused the American Medical Association to forward a discussion where 29 out of 30 pharmacists and drug industry reps spoke out against his wants to ban the plant. And one claim said, quote, "Absolute rot. It is not necessary. I have never known of its misuse," unquote. So despite many counters criticizing Anslinger's blatant arrogance, it's a tongue twister, none of them were ever preserved with the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which was led by Anslinger. And for some reason, this led to a sudden increase of reports claiming cannabis caused violent crimes, no doubt linked to the propaganda and agenda Anslinger was already knee-deep in. So despite no evidence to support his claims, he still continued full steam ahead and sought to put the distribution and regulation of cannabis under federal control. His plan involved promoting his beliefs via mass media, and eventually he gained the support of publisher William Randolph Hearst, owner of the New York Journal, which was known for popularizing yellow journalism, which is a kind of journalism that uses eye-catching headlines that over-exaggerate and sensationalize stories to sell more newspapers. I am sure you can think of quite a few that are like that. Anslinger quickly used his friendship to spread misinformation about cannabis through the tabloids, articles, and other widely distributed print material. One quote of Anslinger's reads, quote, "By the tons by the tons, it is coming into this country. The deadly, dreadful poison that racks and tears not only the body, but the very heart and soul of every human being who once becomes a slave to it in any of its cruel and devastating forms. Marijuana is a shortcut to the insane asylum. Smoke marijuana cigarettes for a month, and what was once your brain will be nothing but storehouse of horrid specters. Hashish makes a murderer who kills for the love of killing out of the mildest mannered man who ever laughed at the idea that any habit could ever get him. A little dramatic, if you ask me, but, you know.
I don't know. I feel like a lot of the time when I get high, I want to go out and go on a killing spree personally, but maybe that's just me. I must be smoking the wrong stuff.
I think that is just you. I always say this when I'm talking kind of like about cannabis is if I'm in a room full of like really drunk people, I usually am a little like afraid. I'm like a little worried for my safety. But when I'm in a room of stoners, I'm really not, because like everybody's just trying to chill. You know what I mean?
I feel very much the same way. Carry on.
Thank you. So, using his past experience in law enforcement, many of his stories were terse and concise, mirroring a police report, and often told graphic accounts of offenses caused by drug users. One story he told ended up being a reference in the film Reefer Madness, which is the most widely known propaganda film, and that being of Victor Licata, a young man in Florida who Anslinger used to smear the name of cannabis. He wrote, quote, "An entire family was murdered by the youthful addict in Florida. When officers arrived at the home, they found the youth staggering about in a human slaughterhouse. With an axe, he had killed his father, mother, 2 brothers, and a sister. He seemed to be in a daze. He had no recollection of having committed the multiple crimes. The officers knew him ordinarily as a sane, rather quiet young man. Now he was pitifully crazed. They sought the reason, and the boy said that he had been in the habit of smoking something which youthful friends called muggles, a childish name for marijuana. It was later discovered that Victor murdered his family due to a severe mental illness that he had been diagnosed with in his early youth, something Anslinger would never reference when using this case in his defense against cannabis, interestingly enough. So during the 1930s, Anslinger's deeply problematic beliefs gained traction and his articles became overly racially themed, so much so that it caused other conservative politicians to call him to resign due to his racist remarks. One remark said, quote, "Colored students at the University of Minnesota partying with white females, students smoking marijuana and getting their sympathy stories of racial persecution. Results? Pregnancy." Wild claim. He continued to radicalize his views and was actively deemed so racist he would be considered crazy racist in the 1920s. One of his statements that can, I think, really sum up his belief is, quote, "Reefer makes darkies think they're as good as white men," unquote. Okay, so I want to pause for a sec and remind everybody that this man was in a high position of political power, and he did have huge influence over the legislation that was being passed into law. I think it's important to keep that in mind. So outside of this already obvious racist agenda, there was also corruption happening behind the scenes in his political reign. He had huge influence over the laws regarding the regulation and legalization of hemp and hashish, which bled into his close relationship with Hearst's anti-cannabis campaigns, which had hugely influenced politicians like up to that, including President Franklin D. Roosevelt. He was truly in so many people's ear. Despite his powerful allies, Anslinger was continuously scrutinized for insubordination by the medical industry. One such notable moment being when he refused to desist after he fought against the publication of the ABA and AMA's report on narcotic addictions that was edited by professor of sociology and noted critic of Anslinger's, Alfred R. Linsmith from Indiana University. Linsmith would go on to write other works that criticized the war on drugs, especially Anslinger's role in it, which would eventually lead to his outing as the commissioner of the FBN. And one of the biggest political scandals of his was his role in providing Senator Joseph McCarthy with copious amounts of morphine, something he was already dangerously addicted to. This addiction was funded by the Bureau under Anslinger's watch and continued until McCarthy's death in 1957. And despite this controversy, he still served under President John F. Kennedy in 1961, during which his health started to decline and he was treated with regular doses of morphine, the same drug that he smuggled to Senator McCarthy. So Anslinger died of heart failure on November 14th, 1975, at 83 years old, which I find very impressive considering the era that he was born in. All right, so I know we just did a lot of talking. There's a lot of different acronyms coming in, so I'm going to throw it to a little smoke sesh. I do believe we have a little clip of Reefer Madness, which is a very popular propaganda film that you might know. So we're going to throw it to that. I'm going to take a moment to regroup, and we'll get back to things. Okay?
If you want a good smoke, try one of these. I thought you were a flirt. Of course, if you're afraid. I know you like that. Really, you will. And just take a puff of it.
Alrighty, welcome back. That clip makes me giggle every time. Honestly, it makes hanging out in a room full of people smoking reefer look pretty fun. They were
it just makes it look awesome.
They're like, they started laughing together.
I want to hang out with those people. They're joyous.
Much more joyous than people probably normally were. All right, so let's get back to cannabis. So as we get back to the main crux of this episode, the history of cannabis in the United States, you might see hints or blatant evidence of the influence Harry J. Anslinger had on cannabis and its inaccurate representation through our political, geopolitical, and social systems. So let's pick up where we left off around 1925 before. Before break, I was talking about the rise of racial tensions that the Great Depression spurred into legislation. So around the same time, the United States expanded into international law and conversation showing support for the regulation of hashish, which is a compressed form of cannabis. It's very concentrated, and it was consumed at hashish houses that were equivalent to opium dens for cannabis, in a way. This vote banned the exportation of what was called Indian hemp to any country that had prohibited the use of the plant. They didn't, however, ban the fiber trade, just the drug trade of cannabis. Around the same time as this conversation, the Uniform State Narcotic Drug Act moved to encourage states to help federalize the regulation of cannabis, and in 1930, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, headed by our friend Harry J. Anslinger, moved to outlaw all recreational drugs. In 1936, Anslinger represented the U.S. at the International Convention for the Suppression of the Illicit Traffic of Dangerous Drugs, where he pushed to criminalize all activities in the treaty, which included the cultivation, production, manufacture, and distribution of narcotics, including cannabis, both medically and for recreational purposes. Many countries did not agree about this, wanting to only focus on drug trafficking, but the U.S. refused to sign the final version of the treaty because Anslinger considered it to be too weak. So back in the States, the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 was passed, which made the transfer of possessions of cannabis throughout the country illegal under federal law, and a hefty tax was added to all industry sellers within the medical world. The American Medical Association opposed this act because it limited physicians, pharmacists, cultivators, and manufacturers in the ways that they could operate within their fields and in turn within the industry. The passing of this tax was poorly supported and was based almost fully on Anslinger's and the FBN claiming an increase in reports of people smoking marijuana. So this led to disputes around Anslinger's questionable relationship, that's a hard name to keep saying, his questionable relationship with the commercial lumber and paper industry after the publication of the USDA Bulletin number 404, Hemp Herds and Paper Making Material, stated hemp was much more favorable than wood pulp to make paper, as well as more resourceful. Wanting to continue the narrative around cannabis being dangerous, hemp as a textile was looped into the narcotic conversation and attacked aggressively. Anti-weed propaganda hit the scene with the help of Anslinger and his good buddy William Randolph Hearst's empire of yellow journalism papers. Oddly enough, in true political fashion, once we entered World War II, the U.S. Army urged an uptake in hemp, despite it being outlawed, and over 400,000 acres of hemp were cultivated between 1942 and 45 to provide the fibers needed for military operations. In 1952, the Boggs Act introduced mandatory sentencing, and with the Narcotics Control Act of 1956, it made first-time cannabis possession offenses a minimum of 2 to 10 years with a fine of up to $20,000. But it is good to note, in 1970, mandatory sentences were repealed for cannabis offenses. So, give and take. In 1969, the U.S. Supreme Court held the Marijuana Tax Act to be an unconstitutional act and violated the Fifth Amendment, which limits the government's power in regards to criminal procedures in court. In response, Congress passed the Controlled Substance Act, further prohibiting the use of cannabis for any purpose, and it was assigned as a Schedule I classification. So this classification deemed the plant to be highly addictive, abusive, and that it had no medical use. And to be clear, like other drugs in this category include heroin, LSD, ecstasy, and peyote, to name a few. In 1968, the Department of Treasury and the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare merged bureaus to create the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs as a Department of Justice subsidiary. Nixon then created the Drug Enforcement Administration by merging the new Bureau of Narcotics and Danger Drugs with the Office of Drug Abuse Law Enforcement. And if you are at all familiar with cannabis laws, you will have definitely heard of the DEA. They are still in charge of the regulation of cannabis within states that have legalized it. And not only do they enforce the laws prohibiting cannabis, they also are the ones in charge of the laws regulating cannabis. So an interesting power dynamic, I must say. So in 1984, the Reagan administration passed the Comprehensive Crime Control Act, which allowed the reinstatement of mandatory prison sentences for possession or use of cannabis, which led to the infamous Three Strikes Law, which created a mandatory 25-year sentence for repeated crimes, including drug offenses, and even the death penalty for those that were deemed drug kingpins. In 1998, cannabis gets a momentary win, and in California, voters approved Proposition 215 that legalized medical cannabis. This quickly led to the creation of the Oakland Cannabis Buyers Cooperative, which operated to provide seriously ill patients with safe and reliable source of medical cannabis information and patient support, which was then sued by the U.S. government, and Congress rejected the cooperative's defense of the common law medical necessity and deemed it had no medical use, and it violated the Controlled Substance Act, which forbade any production, distribution, manufacturing, and possession of cannabis. In 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that even if someone or a business was in accordance with state-approved cannabis programs, it was still federally illegal and could be tried as such. And in no surprise, routine targeting and arrests of medical cannabis patients and the seizure of medical cannabis and business assets became a big priority to the DEA. Finally, in 2018, the Cole Memorandum, which discouraged U.S. attorneys from enforcing federal law against state legal cannabis operations, was rescinded by the Attorney General Jeff Sessions. Thanks, Trump. And that brings us to our current timeline of where we are in regards to the history of cannabis in our political system. Okay, so before we get into the decriminalization history of this plant, I'm going to throw it to another smoke sesh, and we're going to regroup and get into the zone. How's that sound? Hey, y'all. Callie here. I just wanted to take a moment to come on and talk about a new podcast that we're going to have coming this week. We're just rolling them out. It's going to be called Unmasked, the Musing of Two Neurodivergent... What? Millennials. Can you tell we just hit a smoke sesh? Yes, the Musing of Two Neurodivergent Millennials. My bestie Alexis and I are just going to be chatting about the experiences that we have had being incredibly neurodivergent just in the world. And we're probably going to start from our experiences in the performance industry because we're both little child professionals. So if you have the chance, tune in this Thursday at 7 p.m. We're going to try to go live then. Otherwise, listen to it afterwards. So thanks. Just join us. We'll have a good time. Also, just thanks for listening. Bye. Right. Welcome back to Yes We Cannabis, where we are talking about the history of medical cannabis in this country. Now that we have covered the history of the plant's rise in our country and like within the political system, let's celebrate with the decriminalization wins of our history. So in 1972, the Comprehensive Drug Act, Prevention and Control Act formed a commission to study the rising use of cannabis in America to aid in policy decisions. So this did not lead to federal reform, but it was very influential for all the decriminalization laws that were trying to be passed during the 70s. So a very important moment. In 1973, Oregon became the first state to decriminalize cannabis, and they reduced the penalty to a $100 fine. This led to Alaska, Maine, Colorado, California, Ohio, Minnesota, Mississippi, New York, North Carolina, and Nebraska all followed suit through the next 3 years. In 1975, the Compassionate Care Act was passed when a resident of D.C., Robert Randall, was arrested for cultivating cannabis. He had been using medical marijuana to relieve his symptoms of his glaucoma, and he used medical necessity in defense at his trial. His charges were dismissed, and he was the first patient to benefit from the Compassionate Investigational New Drug Program that was birthed from his trial. So this program allows folks with severe medical conditions to apply and be supplied their medical cannabis by the federal government. This program, as expected, was not a huge success due to the difficulties that arose out of how difficult and drawn out and complicated it was to apply to. In 1975, Alaska upheld the protection of an adult... Ooh, hold on. My brain went a little crazy. But we're starting that moment. All right. So... in 1975, Alaska upheld the protection of an adult's ability to possess and use small amounts of cannabis by announcing constitutional privacy in hopes of protection from the federal government. This was upheld for a while until it was overridden in a 1990 ballot that recriminalized the plant. In 1992, the Compassionate IND program that we talked about before was closed due to new patients when it was flooded with applications from people with AIDS looking to relieve their symptoms. The government believed this program went against the Bush administration's push to discourage drug use with a little program known as DARE. If you are a millennial, especially, I'm sure you have memories of the DARE assemblies that we would just go to at school. And we all had the shirt. We all loved the briefcase of fake drugs. It was a raging success, obviously. The program would only have a total of 13 patients through its existence, and only 2 of those are still alive today. In the 1970s, we saw a number of states passing legislation around the medical use of cannabis. New Mexico was the first in 1978, and over 30 states followed suit by 1982. But implementation of these laws was not practiced often because of the power the federal government had around cannabis use. So, unfortunately, great, but... In 1972, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws petitioned what is now known as the DEA to declassify cannabis from a Schedule I drug, which would allow physicians to prescribe it. After over a decade of battles to even get the DEA to consider the petition, public hearings led to the eventual 2-year fight. The DEA Chief Administrative Law Judge, Francis Young, ruled in favor of the petition to make it a Schedule II classification, stating, quote, "Marijuana in its natural form is one of the safest therapeutically active substances known to man," unquote. And despite his findings, it was then rejected by the DEA Administrator John Lawn in 1989, thus killing the petition. In 1991, 79% of San Francisco voters approved Proposition P, which expressed support for the medical use of cannabis. This led to the first cannabis dispensaries to be opened and to operate in the U.S., allowed by city officials despite the fact that it violated state and federal law. So following this win, advocates turned their attention to state legislation, and in 1994, 2 medical cannabis bills were approved by state legislators, but then they were vetoed by Governor Pete Wilson. This led to cannabis advocates collecting 775,000 signatures to get the bills on the statewide ballot. And in 1996, California became the first state to legalize the medical use of cannabis with Proposition 215 with 56% of the vote. It also gave patients and caregivers the right to cultivate cannabis for personal use, which is huge. So this led to 5 more state ballot initiatives, and in 1998, Washington, Oregon, Alaska, Nevada, and D.C. legalized the use of medical marijuana, followed by Maine, Nevada, and Colorado the next 3 years. And in 2000, Hawaii became the first state to legalize medical cannabis with state legislation, which is huge. In 2000, after the Proposition 215 was passed, the Clinton administration doubled down on their stance against medical cannabis and threatened to revoke the abilities for doctors to write prescriptions and suggest the plant for medical use. This was challenged by a group of physicians, and the right to recommend but not prescribe cannabis was affirmed. This resulted in the still followed law that medical use can only be recommended by a doctor and not prescribed. That is something that is also important for like me as a medical cannabis consultant. I can't talk about anything that like actually it says it is. We have to say it is known to help these things instead of it helps, which is just, you know, a little bit of it's a little gray. It's a little tricky, but we make it work. All right. So in 2001, a second wave of states moved to decriminalize cannabis, starting with Nevada, followed by Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Vermont, D.C., Maryland, Missouri, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Delaware, Illinois, New Hampshire, New Mexico, North Dakota, Hawaii, and Virginia during the span of the next 19 years. In 2009, the DOJ issued a memo advising U.S. attorneys to only prosecute medical users if they have violated state law or another federally illegal activity, such as money laundering. Unfortunately, this led to an uptake in raids, and despite the pushback from the public, it didn't do much to slow the DOJ's actions. This led to Congress passing the Ron Rebacher Farr Amendments, so many big names, which prohibited the federal prosecution of someone acting in accordance with state medical cannabis laws. It passed in 2014 and has since been included in approved bills. The law is still interpreted by the DOJ in less savory ways, but it did add some more protection, at least, which is always a good thing when it comes to cannabis. So the first state to legalize recreational cannabis, or the first states, were Colorado and Washington, whoop whoop, in 2012. Both of these include personal cultivation for up to 6 plants for medical users, and it also allows commercial cultivation and sales that are subject to heavy taxes and regulation. And I do want to say, when it comes to like taxes here in Washington, when I say heavy, I do mean heavy. There is a 37% sales tax on cannabis. So it is a lot. It's on 40%. So, you know, and then we have an additional 10% sales tax on top of that. So it sure can be hefty. Also, it can generate a lot of money for states that they could put back into their communities. Just saying. All right. Where was I? Okay, and in 2014, Alaska, Oregon, and D.C. followed suit. The legalization of cannabis use and sale on Native American reservations passed in 2014, and the Flandreau-Sainte-Sioux tribe was the first to legalize the use of recreational cannabis. In 2016, California, Nevada, Massachusetts, and Maine followed suit, and Vermont was the first to legalize recreational marijuana in 2018 through state legislation. Again, very big. In 2018, legalization of hemp production with low levels of Delta-9 THC passed, which inadvertently allowed the cultivation of hemp with high levels of Delta-8 THC, which is a psychoactive cannabinoid. An oversight by political leaders, for sure, but also we didn't have the research prior, so a discovery. In 2019, Illinois legalized commercial sale in state legislation, and in 2020, Arizona, Montana, New Jersey, and South Dakota all legalized recreational sale. So the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act of 2020 was the first time Congress voted to legalize cannabis on a federal level, which is still in debate. And in October of 2022, President Biden announced a pardon for people convicted of simple possession charges in federal court, which broadened to include other offenses in 2023, which almost brings us up to date on the current state of our cannabis world as like a classified drug in our country. So in 2022, the medical marijuana and cannabidiol, goddamn, CBD, Research Expansion Act was signed into law by President Biden, which was the first federal level standalone reform bill to be passed. It opened the door to extensive research of the plant, which has led to leaps in our knowledge and understanding of it on like a molecular and medicinal level. This was also a catalyst for the conversation of reclassification. And in 2024, the DEA deemed cannabis a Schedule III drug. Huge, huge win. Yes, deserves a round of applause. So as of now, there are 24 states where the use of recreational cannabis is legal, and another 14 where the medical cannabis can be accessed, which is really great. Obviously, we would love more, but we're working on it. So I told you that we were going to get political, but I do truly believe that you cannot talk cannabis without really understanding the history of it in our country, especially as it is directly tied to the foundations of our country. And it's perhaps the most important textile industry that also built our country. To go from being grown by the first president of our country, well, you know, who actually grew the cannabis, to such like an aggressively criminalized and propaganda fueled like progression of laws. It shows no regard to to all the different voices that actually understood the plant, and it's something that still happens to this day. I think it's interesting that we don't teach a lot of these. We don't teach about the politicians who are making a lot of decisions like through our history. We were just kind of like talking about them loosely, but I do think a lot of history is left out of our curriculums, especially if you are like go to a public school, because indeed they are federally regulated. So there are like many other bills and laws and like regulation that does exist within the cannabis world, both recreationally and medicinally, but we would be here all night. And I know I already loaded y'all with so much information, so I am going to call it there on like this episode in that way. And you know, it was an ever not so brief summary of the history of cannabis, but you know, there are so many systematic issues that we could also be deconstructing, and like oppression that we need to talk about that exist in laws. But it is very important, I think, to really give those subjects like the time that they need and the weight that they need, because we start getting really dicey when it comes to this stuff. I do want to acknowledge the incredible collection of research that Wikipedia has on the subject, as well as the University of Georgia's Alexander Campbell King Law Library for being great resources. And before you scoff at Wikipedia, there were 203 sources that inform this collection of information, and that is a lot of resources. And you would be surprised how often Wikipedia does tell the true stories around historic events. And when it comes to reliable sources, I do usually trust the public to have a little more integrity when compiling research over agenda-funded papers. I just can't help it. So obviously, we are still in the middle of a lot of history being made with cannabis. I kind of mentioned the fact that the act that allowed us to start researching it. And since then, we have made huge strides. We went from like 2 cannabinoids being like available in stores to at least 5, which is incredible considering THC is like so there's so much THC in cannabis, and like the other ones are a little harder to find, but we're finding them and we are like extracting them and we are putting them in like large quantities to really help boost like medicinal cannabis. And I also want to acknowledge that despite the movement to like pardon people, there are still a large percentage of people in jail that have minor offenses when it comes to cannabis. So we still have a really long way to go with that, but we are at least moving in the right direction. I can actively say that I'm very excited to be a part of like the continued observance of this industry and of this plant as it continues to grow. We're still going to come up against a lot of pushback for sure. We're still going to get a lot of false narratives being told about the plants, but ultimately we're going to start having science to back us up, which is pretty rad, you know? So thanks for joining me. I appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did, because I actively really love researching this and putting it together. And thanks for the patience of this coming out on a Wednesday evening. When I first started writing this episode up, it proved to be a bigger endeavor than I anticipated. And also, Zach put a lot of cool production into it, so we wanted to wait.
Well, if we want to peel back the curtain a little further, too, you didn't even start planning this episode until yesterday morning. And you busted your buns getting this ready all day yesterday.
That's
a
true.
Good chunk of today.
That is true. I work best
given
under
the circumstances, pressure. We thought we were going to have a different episode for you, but I think you killed it.
Yeah, thanks. I'm exploring an ADHD diagnosis with my therapist, so I love procrastination, I'll tell you that much. But I work really well under pressure as well. Again, thanks for joining us. Today has been a pretty rough mental health day for me, but being able to come back and focus on this evening has been really re-energizing. So thanks. I really appreciate it. Cool. Next week, I'm hoping that we have a first of it's kind interview with potentially a cannabis farm. Or I have another potential guest in mind. So I'm going to do some reaching out, but I think it's going to be really excited. It'll be more of a discussion of cannabis with other people in the community. So stick around for that. It's going to be great. And until then, take care of yourself. If you need to take a mental health day, please do. Listen to your body. It's not worth burnout. I just want to I'm going to keep talking about that. And if you are interested in conversations about mental health, please watch mine and Alexis's show Unmasked. That's going to be on Thursday. We feel ready to get into the nitty-gritty of things, so come prepared. All right. Thanks, y'all. Enjoy the rest of your evening.